The city had fallen. What began as isolated reports of a strange sickness had erupted into a nightmare. The infected didn't just die, they changed. Their bodies twisted into something monstrous, their flesh still warm, but their minds lost to an insatiable hunger. Worse still, the infection spread through wounds. One scratch, one bite, and you were doomed. In the midst of the chaos, a group of strangers found themselves trapped inside a gas station on the outskirts of town. The store was dimly lit, the hum of the refrigerators the only sound aside from their panicked breathing. Connor stood near the counter, gripping a blood-stained tire iron. A construction worker by trade, he had been on his way home when he saw his coworker get torn apart in the street. He had barely escaped. Now, his hands were still shaking from the memory. Behind the shelves, Lena, a paramedic, was wrapping a bandage around her arm. The wound wasn't a bite, it was a deep gash from breaking a car window to escape. But the others still eyed her warily. She noticed Anthony, a college student, gripping a baseball bat, his knuckles white. "It's not a bite," Lena assured them, tying the bandage tight. "If it was, I'd tell you." Across from her, Marco, an ex-cop, exhaled sharply. "You understand why we have to be careful." Lena nodded. She wasn't offended. She'd seen what happened to people who let their guard down. Near the entrance, Becca, a teenager with a torn hoodie, peeked through the boarded-up windows. "They're still out there," she whispered. Outside, the dead roamed. Some staggered aimlessly, but others twitched at sudden movements, as if their senses hadn't completely withered away. The worst ones, the fresh ones, moved faster. A distant scream echoed through the streets. Becca flinched. "We can't stay here forever," Connor muttered. "No," Marco agreed. "We need a plan." The gas station had food, water, and weapons of convenience, but it wasn't defensible. The windows were glass, and the doors wouldn't hold against a determined horde. Sooner or later, the infected would find them. "There's a warehouse a few miles from here," Lena said. "I treated a guy who worked there. It has supplies, security gates." Anthony cut in. "How do we know it's safe?" "We don't," she admitted. "But it's better than waiting here to die." Silence settled over the group. They all knew what this world had become. The question wasn't if they would run, it was when. Then, the sound came. A low, guttural moan. Everyone froze. Becca stepped back from the window, her face pale. "They know we're here." Then, bang. A body slammed against the glass. More moans joined the first. Shadows gathered outside, dozens of them. Their fingers scraped against the windows, leaving streaks of blood. The front door shuddered. Lena grabbed her bag. "We need to move. Now." Connor tightened his grip on the tire iron. Back door. Marco unholstered a pistol, his last bullet chambered. "Stay quiet. Stay close." The group exchanged looks. They weren't friends. They weren't a team. But at this moment, they were each other's only chance. And out there, the city was waiting. The back door groaned as Connor forced it open, the hinges protesting loudly. Every sound felt like an alarm blaring into the night. "Go, go!" Marco whispered harshly, ushering the group into the alley behind the gas station. Lena gripped her backpack tight as she followed, her injured arm throbbing. Anthony was right behind her, his baseball bat clutched like a lifeline. Becca hesitated for half a second before sprinting out, her hoodie flapping behind her. Connor was the last to exit, shoving the door shut just as the front windows shattered. The gas station was no longer a safe haven. The alley was dark, littered with overturned trash cans and the reeking stench of rotting meat. Somewhere nearby, a distant car alarm blared, the sound bouncing off the empty buildings. "We move fast and quiet," Marco instructed. "No noise. No stopping." They crept forward, sticking close to the shadows. The city streets ahead were littered with abandoned cars, flickering streetlights, and bodies, so many bodies. Some were unmoving. Others twitched. A few had already started to rise. Becca sucked in a breath. Jesus. Don't look, Lena whispered. A low moan echoed from the side of the street. One of the infected, a man in a torn suit, stumbled toward them. His head twitched unnaturally, and his jaw hung slack, blackened veins spiderwebbing across his face. Marco raised his pistol but hesitated. One bullet left. I got it, Connor muttered. He gripped his tire iron and stepped forward. One hard swing, crack, the thing dropped. He barely had time to catch his breath before Marco yanked him back. More coming, Marco hissed. From the other end of the street, figures emerged from the shadows. 6, maybe 7. Some dragged broken limbs, others moved with unnatural jerks, but all of them locked onto the scent of fresh meat. We have to run, Anthony whispered. No, Marco said sharply. Running draws them in. We move fast, but steady. Stay close. The group pressed forward, weaving between wrecked cars and bodies, avoiding sudden movements. Becca clutched Lena's arm, her breaths coming out in short, panicked gasps. Then, a loud crash shattered the silence. Anthony had tripped, his back clanging against the pavement. For a moment, everything stood still. Then, the horde reacted. The moans grew louder. The slow walkers became frantic, scrambling over one another to reach their prey. A distant alley erupted with movement, more were coming. Run! Marco shouted. They bolted. Lena yanked Anthony to his feet, dragging him forward. Connor led the way, dodging between wreckage. Marco fired a single shot, taking down a fast-moving infected, but it only seemed to make the others more frenzied. Becca screamed as something grabbed her hoodie, yanking her back. Lena, she cried. Lena spun, saw the infected clawing at the girl, and swung her medical bag at its head. It barely flinched. Connor roared, charging in with his tire iron. One powerful swing caved the thing's skull in. He grabbed Becca, pushing her forward. Keep moving. They turned a corner and found themselves at a four-way intersection. 3 paths. No clear option. More infected poured in from behind. We're trapped, Anthony gasped. Marco scanned the area, his eyes landing on a flickering neon sign. There, he pointed. A pawn shop, metal shutters half open. No time to think. They sprinted toward it, diving under the gate. Marco and Connor yanked it down just as the infected slammed against it, their rotting hands reaching through the bars. Panting, the group collapsed inside. Becca curled up against the counter, sobbing quietly. Lena checked Anthony, he was unharmed, just shaken. Marco pressed his back against the door, wiping sweat from his brow. That was too close. Connor stood, still gripping his weapon. We can't keep running like this. We need a real plan. Lena nodded, catching her breath. Because out there? There's no safe haven. Outside, the undead screeched and clawed at the metal gate. And somewhere, in the heart of the city, something worse was waiting. The pawn shop was dark, the only light filtering in from the street through gaps in the metal shutters. The air smelled of dust, old leather, and rusted metal. Becca sat curled in a corner, arms wrapped around her knees, her body trembling. Anthony paced near the counter, rubbing a hand down his face. Connor leaned against a display case filled with cheap watches, his grip tight around the blood-stained tire iron. Outside, the infected still clawed at the metal gate, their moans rising and falling like a chorus of the damned. Lena knelt by the shelves, checking what little supplies they had left. We're running low on water, she muttered. And food. Marco exhaled sharply, checking the last bullet in his pistol. This place won't hold. Sooner or later, they'll find a way in. Connor nodded. We need to get to that warehouse. Sitting here waiting to die isn't an option. Becca's voice was barely above a whisper. What if the warehouse isn't safe either? The question lingered in the air. None of them had an answer. Suddenly, bang. Something slammed into the back door. The group froze. Lena's heart pounded. That wasn't a walker. Another bang. Then a voice. Hey! I know you're in there. Let me in. The voice was desperate, male, young. He banged on the door again. Please. They're coming. Marco hesitated. Could be a trap. Connor's jaw clenched. Or he's just like us, trying to survive. Lena stood, moving toward the door. Marco grabbed her wrist. We don't know him. We didn't know each other yesterday either, she shot back. Another bang, then a blood-curdling scream. Help me! Screeches and snarls followed. Shit! Connor moved first, yanking the lock. The door swung open, revealing a young man, maybe in his early 20s, covered in blood. He stumbled inside, panting, his eyes wide with terror. Behind him, four infected sprinted down the alley. Connor barely had time to react before one lunged. He swung his tire iron, crack, but another shoved through. Gunfire erupted. Marco took down the second walker with a single shot. Anthony, panicked, swung his bat wildly, missing completely. Becca grabbed a rusted knife from the counter and stabbed at the third infected shoulder. It shrieked but kept coming. Lena, thinking fast, grabbed a crowbar from the shelf and drove it through the last one's skull. The shop fell into silence, save for the heavy breathing of the group. The young man collapsed to his knees, coughing. Jesus! I thought I was dead. Marco slammed the door shut, locking it again. You almost were. Connor turned to the newcomer. Who the hell are you? The guy wiped blood from his face. Toby. I was holed up at the diner a few blocks down. It got overrun. His voice shook. I ran. I had nowhere else to go. Lena crouched beside him. Are you bitten? No. No, it's not mine. I swear. Marco studied him for a long moment. All right, he muttered. For now, you stay. But if you turn, I'll put you down myself. Toby swallowed hard and nodded. Connor sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. We can't stay here. That gunshot? It'll bring more of them. Marco glanced at the blocked windows. We wait for dawn. Then we move. The group settled in, uneasy, exhausted. Outside, the city groaned and whispered with the sounds of the dead. And somewhere in the darkness, something far worse was listening. The night was long. Outside, the dead moaned and scraped against the metal gate, but they weren't the only ones out there. Something else was moving in the dark. Lena heard it first, faint, careful footsteps just beyond the alley. Not the clumsy dragging of a walker, but something more deliberate. More human. She glanced at Marco, who had dozed off near the door, his pistol still clutched in his hand. Becca and Anthony were curled up in a corner, too exhausted to fight sleep. Connor sat near the front, watching the street through a crack in the shutters. Lena nudged him. You hear that? She whispered. Connor frowned, listening. Then, a low whistle. Not from the dead. Connor tensed. Shit. Marco stirred. What? Connor gestured for silence. Then, the voice came. Hello in there, a man called softly. Saw your little stunt earlier. Quite the show. The group froze. Connor gritted his teeth. Someone had been watching. Marco stood, gun in hand, his expression cold. We don't want trouble, he called back. A chuckle. Oh, buddy, trouble ain't up to you. See, you just killed some of my friends out there. And I gotta say, I take that personally. Becca's breath hitched. Anthony's grip on the baseball bat tightened. Lena's mind raced. Walkers were one thing, but other survivors? Those were unpredictable. Dangerous. We didn't know they were yours, Marco said, his voice calm but firm. The man outside whistled again. No hard feelings. Just come on out. Let's talk. Connor exchanged a look with Marco. They weren't going out there. Marco sighed. We stay quiet, they might move on. Toby, still shaken from his escape, whispered, You don't know these kinds of people. They don't leave. Outside, boots crunched against broken glass. There was more than one of them. Lena's stomach twisted. A gang. Last chance, the man said. His tone was still casual, but there was a sharpness beneath it. Come out, or we come in. Connor clenched his jaw. They don't know how many of us there are. If we keep it that way, we have a chance. Then, bang. A shotgun blast tore through the metal shutters. Becca screamed. Marco shoved her down. Get to the back. Another shot. The front glass display shattered. Shadows moved outside, at least 3, maybe more. We need to move, Lena said urgently. Connor grabbed his tire iron. Back door. Now. Marco fired a shot through the window. A scream followed. That's for shooting first, asshole. Anthony grabbed Becca's arm, pulling her toward the back. Toby followed, still shaking. Lena yanked open the back door, then froze. A figure was waiting in the alley. A woman, dressed in filthy tactical gear, a pistol in one hand. She smirked. Going somewhere? Before Lena could react, Connor barreled into the woman, knocking her aside. Run, he roared. The group bolted into the alley. Gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets whizzed past, hitting brick and metal. The night air was thick with smoke, sweat, and fear. The warehouse was still miles away. The city was a maze of death traps. And now? They weren't just running from the dead. They were being hunted. The city was a graveyard of the old world, empty streets littered with burnt-out cars, broken glass, and the stench of rot. But as Connor, Lena, Marco, Becca, Anthony, and Toby sprinted through the darkness, they weren't just escaping the dead. They were being hunted. Gunfire cracked behind them. Left! Marco shouted. They swerved into a narrow alley. Connor shoved a dumpster over to block the path, buying them a few seconds. They needed distance. We can't outrun bullets, Lena gasped. We don't have to, Connor grunted. We just have to make them hesitate. They burst onto another street, only to freeze. More walkers. Dozens of them. Their lifeless eyes snapped to the group, moans rising into the night. Shit, Anthony breathed. Behind them, their pursuers, ***, the gang of survivors who wanted blood, ***, were still coming. Nowhere to run. Inside. Marco pointed to an overturned bus, its shattered windows yawning open like a beast's mouth. One by one, they scrambled in. Becca barely made it before a gang member rounded the corner, shotgun raised. Boom. The shot missed by inches, tearing through metal instead. Inside the bus, the group ducked low. Outside, the walkers were closing in. We're trapped, Toby whispered. Connor clenched his jaw. No. Not yet. He scanned the bus. The emergency hatch on the roof, their only way out. The roof, he whispered. Go. One by one, they climbed. Connor lifted Becca first, then Anthony, then Lena. Marco covered them, gun still warm in his grip. The gang members outside hesitated as the walkers reached them. Screams erupted. Flesh tore. Chaos. It was the only chance they'd get. Connor pulled himself onto the roof and looked around. The warehouse wasn't far now, a few blocks at most. Jump to the next building, he said. The group stared at him like he was insane. But there was no time. The gang was losing to the walkers, but they weren't all dead yet. One of them, a burly man with a machete, spotted them on the roof. You bastards ain't getting away that easy, he roared. He started climbing the bus. Go! Connor barked. One by one, they jumped onto the adjacent rooftop. Becca barely made it, landing hard on her knees. The last to go, Connor turned just as the machete-wielding man reached him. The two locked eyes. The man swung, Connor dodged, then slammed his tire iron into the man's ribs. The guy stumbled, lost balance, and fell into the horde below. His screams didn't last long. Connor took one last look at the massacre below, then jumped to the rooftop. Marco grabbed his arm, pulling him up. They ran. One more block to the warehouse. But as they neared the edge of the city, a terrifying thought settled in Lena's mind. They had made it past the dead. Past the living. But what if the warehouse wasn't salvation? What if it was just another trap? The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted exterior bathed in the dim glow of the moon. It was massive, an old shipping facility, its high fences still mostly intact. The sight filled Lena with a brief flicker of hope. But hope was dangerous. Hope got people killed. Connor was the first to reach the fence. He tested the metal, sturdy enough to hold off walkers, but not forever. The gate was chained shut. "We climb," Marco said, already scaling it. One by one, they hoisted themselves up and over. Becca slipped halfway, but Anthony caught her arm, gritting his teeth as he pulled her up. They weren't losing anyone now. Toby was the last to climb. He was halfway up when gunfire erupted behind them. "Son of a," Marco spun, pistol raised. One of the gang members had survived. Two, actually. A woman with a rifle. A man limping but still dangerous. They had followed. Toby froze on the fence. The woman aimed. Boom. A shot rang out, but it wasn't hers. She gasped, clutching her side as she stumbled back. Toby reached the top and dropped down. Marco stood, gun smoking. One bullet left. The limping man snarled, raising his own weapon. Marco didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, click. Empty. The man grinned. Raised his gun. Connor hurled his tire iron, and it slammed into the man's face. The gun fired, but the shot went wide as the man collapsed. Connor wasted no time, he ran up and finished the job. Silence. The gang was dead. Becca covered her mouth, shaking. Anthony exhaled sharply. Toby wiped sweat from his brow. Lena turned to Marco, who stood motionless, staring at his empty gun. "You good?" she asked. He nodded once. "Yeah." But his hands were still shaking. Connor kicked open the warehouse door. Darkness. Silence. The air inside was stale, untouched for years. Dust floated in the pale moonlight filtering through broken skylights. Anthony found a flashlight and clicked it on. Shelves, crates, some old supplies, but no signs of life. "We made it," Becca whispered. For the first time in days, they could breathe. But Lena still felt uneasy. She scanned the shadows. Something about this place felt off. Then, a noise. A soft clink from deeper inside. Lena stiffened. "Did you hear that?" The others turned, listening. Silence. Then, footsteps. Not walkers. Connor raised his weapon. Marco, despite his empty gun, took point. A voice called out. "You're late." A figure emerged, a man, older, wearing tactical gear. A rifle slung over his shoulder. Behind him, more figures stepped into the light. Armed. Watching. Lena's stomach dropped. Becca whispered, "I thought this place was abandoned." The older man smirked. "Not anymore." Connor clenched his jaw. They had survived the dead. The hunters. The city itself. But now? They had just walked into someone else's territory. And in this world, no place was safe. The end.